Today's conversation is with Coro Strandberg. Coro, I would describe her as one of Canada's leaders on corporate social responsibility, and now she's working in what you would call purpose. What is the purpose of organizations? She has helped corporations, associations. She is a consultant. Before she was a consultant, I'm actually not sure what she did, but she has been in the CSR ESG space for decades, and I think you're going to really enjoy the conversation with Coro.
My name is Rachel Wilding, and then I have Coro Strandberg here, and we're just going to ask a few questions. So question number 1 is, how did you get started in your career path?
Yeah, well, that's a big question, isn't it? To be honest, in thinking about answering it, I pondered the question, well, what's considered a career path? How does one actually define, a career path? And in a way, one has multiple career paths, and they start at different points and they intersect. And that's been my experience. It's not linear. A path suggests it's linear, but it's never really quite so linear. So I had to really wrestle with, what did I even think that term meant from a start? I'm delighted to sort of share how I feel things evolved for me. But first, I want to say I found that I worked in all the sectors. I worked in the private sector, I've worked in the nonprofit sector, and I've worked in the government sector. So I didn't set out to work in all those sectors, but looking back, that is what I have done. And similarly, I've worked in the social sustainability area, I've worked in the economic or finance sustainability area, and I've worked in the environmental sustainability area. And I didn't set out to work in all of those domains, but partway through my career, I realized that I had social and economic sustainability experience, but I didn't have environmental sustainability experience. So when I realized that when I was about 35, then I set out to get experience in the environmental sector. And so by the time I was 40, I'd had experience in all those, for-profit, not-for-profit government sectors, social, economic, and environmental sustainability sectors. And that is what really led to a pivot in my career when I was about 40. So I will sort of get to that in a minute, but that is really fundamental to how things evolved for me and how I started to eventually make intentional career decisions rather than just like falling into things. I sort of switched my perspective to then intentionally going into spaces and intentionally creating outcomes in those spaces. So it's a sort of a shift in perspective. But how it all started back in the day was, of course, volunteering. And if I compare the volunteering I did when I was in my teens to the type of volunteering my kids have done, their volunteering was way more impactful, way more intentional, actively seeking out organizations to work for, volunteering at their high school, all these things. Back in my day, I just sort of randomly fell into volunteering for people with disabilities. And I did some volunteer work in that area. So anyways, it sort of started there, and that got me interested in becoming a social worker. Then I went and got 2 degrees in social work. And just to reflect on that for a moment, those degrees, which I got basically almost back to back, I equipped me to work in community development, community organizing, advocacy, social policy, and organizational management, nonprofit management. So that's what those degrees equipped me to do, which was fundamental to how my career grew subsequently. Even though I thought I was just going to go and have a career to help people, I didn't really know what shape that would take until after I graduated from university. While I was in university, I started to research community economic development, and which is an approach to communities defining their own economic path. And so back then, that was in the 1990s, I wrote the first paper on community economic development in British Columbia back then, where I went and I looked to see what kind of communities were involved in different approaches to self-determination around their economic futures. And I wrote a series of case studies, and I did a tour around the province speaking about this. And so that's where I started to work on social and economic issues, was through this idea of community, the social side, and the economic development, using my skills as a social worker. But back then, this was also in the 90s, back then I became I started becoming, I was recruited to boards of directors. So when I was like 22 or 3, I became the chair of the board of directors of a nonprofit organization. That was the Burnaby, where I live, Burnaby Volunteer Center. So I became a board member. And with that experience, I then became a board member of the United Way of Greater Vancouver. And then with that experience and with my community economic development experience, I ran for the board of directors of Van City Credit Union. This was in the 1980s. So as a young person, I had governance experience, which I recommend to other young people as if they're interested to seek out opportunities to become a board member of an organization, whether it's a credit union or a co-op or a nonprofit, but to get early experience in governance, which again is what I did. And that was fundamental to how my career advanced. Meanwhile, while I was on the board of Van City Credit Union, my day job was I was running a social enterprise, which social enterprises was considered to be an element of community economic development, organizing nonprofits taking charge of their own financial futures. So I was the executive director of a senior serving agency in the 1980s. I was the social planner for the city of Surrey. And then from there, I became the director of social policy for the BC government. So now I have provincial government expertise or experience or whatnot. And I did these things while I was on the board of Van City Credit Union. So that takes my career up to the year 2000. And I'm happy to talk about some of the pivots I made in the year 2000 when I retired from the board of Van City and left my day job with the BC government.
Yeah, I just wanted to ask before we go any further, like, where did you go to school to get your undergrad and your graduate
University
degree?
of British Columbia.
For both?
Yeah.
Okay, cool.
Yeah. And notably, my job is to basically advise businesses on how to be a force for good. Social work equipped me with the skills, like I said, of community development, public policy advocacy, community organizing. So I'm basically leveraging all those skills today. And arguably, instead of helping individuals fit the system, I'm trying to change the system that individuals live within. So it's more like systems change kind of work, and social work put me on the path to understand that. Yeah, so that's how it is. I ended up where I did. It's also when I had 2 children, I was a mom of 2 infants at the time, an infant and a toddler in the year 2000, which was when I retired from the board of Van City Credit Union because you can only be there for 12 years. Just for perspective, Van City Credit Union is one of the largest credit unions in Canada. And at the time, it had $1 billion of assets under management. That's when I was a chair. And at Van City, that's where I learned about this idea of business as a force for good. Up until then, like I said, I was working in government, social planning at Surrey, and then the BC government, director of social policy, very influential roles back then. But once I learned about this idea of business as a force for good, I wanted to become part of that movement. Yeah, so I learned about business as a force for good at Van City. And it was at the same time that Van City learned about that idea too. It was in 1992 that we started to put corporate social responsibility into the business plan at the credit union. And a few years later, we started to incentivize our executives through our incentive scheme, our bonus scheme, to deliver on our social outcomes that we'd identified in the business plan. And a few years later, we started to do sustainability reporting. We didn't call it that back then, but we were one of the first organizations in Canada to actually disclose our social impact through our reporting program. And that happened when I was the chair of the board. And as the chair of the board, I became very interested now in this idea of disclosures of impact. So you are accountable for your investments. And what I found out at Van City back then, year 97, 98, 99, that we saw ourselves as an impact organization. We had, but our metrics were 0.1% of impact against our overall operations. So we found out that it was a very small amount of impact we were generating given the size of our organization. So when I found that out, I became interested in pivoting my own career to help other businesses become a force for good and to embed sustainability into the governance of the organization, because that's what I've learned at Van City, how to do it from the board of directors level on down, and then how to put it into a business plan, how to have metrics against it, and how to report against it. I then set out as a what we called back then a corporate social responsibility consultant in the year 2000. So I was 25 years ago, I was one of the first, if you will, CSR consultants in the field. And I as a consultant, I would work from home. Well, of course, we didn't have virtual setups the way we do now. So it's largely phone based and meetings, in-person meetings and that kind of thing. But anyways, as a consultant, I started my consulting work not with a business plan, but with a theory of change. And what I had in mind was, because I also had a background in finance at Van City, where Van City was a leader in socially responsible investing and other things. So I had experience already in social enterprise, socially responsible investment, corporate social responsibility, CSR governance. I had all this experience. I then turned that to my theory of change as a consultant, whereby I set my course to attract work in the area of animating the levers or pulling the levers on the market economy so the market economy could become a force for sustainability. So that became my formula. The market economy, so business and the government's role vis-a-vis business, and then how could business be used as a force for good in those fields that I was telling you about. So after 20 years or so helping businesses become experts in first CSR, then sustainability, then environmental social governance, all the things, in the last 5 to 10 years, I've really started to pivot my career more towards not just sustainability strategies for the firm, but the social purpose of the firm. So why does the firm exist? And so now I'm helping businesses create social purposes as the reason the business exists. And the theory of change there is if the board of directors or if the leaders adopt a social purpose as the reason the business exists, then the business brings all of its enterprise assets, its relationships, its influence and reach and scale to bring its social purpose to life. And so that is a much bigger impact than just using its sustainability strategy to drive impact. So these days now, I'm the president of Strandberg Consulting, and I'm also the chair of the Canadian Purpose Economy Project, which is seeking to pull the levers in the market economy so that all businesses in Canada have a social purpose as their reason to exist, and that they'll be implementing it authentically and collaborating with others to achieve it and disclosing progress on it. So that's the Canadian Purpose Economy Project, where I spend about 2 to 3 days a week now.
Very impressive resume, like a very impressive career path that you've taken and have been on. So how many, like you said, you're the CEO of your company?
Mm-hmm.
How many people do you have employed?
Yeah, so you'd think of me as an independent consultant. I'm a sole proprietor or whatever. I have a company, Strandberg Consulting Inc. And so I'm president of that. And I work in collaboration with others. So mostly you'd see it that way. And the other way of thinking about my consultancy is I think of myself as an impact consultant. So not only do I accept commissions for work, but I also set about creating new fields of practice. And I'm intentional around helping others learn what I've learned. So if you go to my website, you'll see I share everything that I've ever learned from my clients along the way. So through that, I think of myself as a field builder, building a field. So when I learn about business as a force for good, I share what I've learned about that. And then I might ask the government to fund me to write a case study or write a toolkit or and all of those materials, publications, resources, etc., are on the website. So back in the day, it was corporate social responsibility, how to do that. I was hired by Conference Board of Canada. I pitched the work to them. So I said, why don't you hire me to write a thought leader report on how boards should have oversight of corporate social responsibility. That was back in 2008, shortly after I left Van City. So that was the first ever international scan of how boards were having oversight of corporate social responsibility, which I knew how to do at Van City. And then I took those ideas, did a global scan, how are other boards having oversight of CSR? And then I created a toolkit. And then I approached the federal government, who was interested in setting up corporate social responsibility hub on its website. And I said to the federal government, why don't you engage myself and Canadian Business for Social Responsibility to turn these into, to create these guidelines and put them in the federal government's CSR hub. So this was like field building, seeing a gap in knowledge or expertise and creating a body of knowledge, and then making that available and partnering with, in this case, Canadian Business for Social Responsibility or Conference Board or others to amplify and put this kind of information out in the public domain so that others can learn how to advance on that. And then I should say, with this expertise that I was developing in CSR governance, then I was hired by the Directors College to come and start teaching how boards and directors should have oversight of what then became sustainability governance. So then I teach that. I'm a faculty member for Directors College. And similarly, the Governance Professionals of Canada asked me to come and start teaching sustainability governance to corporate secretaries and general counsel and others who, as governance professionals, want to know what's the role of the board in oversight of sustainability. So you can see how this kind of develops, right? You do a thought leader piece, then you get hired to turn that into guidelines, and the government adopts that as guidelines. And then you become like a faculty member to teach directors. And then now what you've learned at Vancity now is being translated into, faculty programs and core curricula. And these are programs to become a certified director or a certified governance professional. So it's now part of these certification system. So it's like field building and capacity building. Meanwhile, helping companies, boards figure out how to have oversight of CSR or ESG, and then helping those organizations have sustainability strategies. And maybe I'll just add another piece of how this has gone. Because of my background in governance, I was appointed to the board of the BC Lottery Corporation. That was 10 years ago, 8 or 10 years ago. So I took everything I knew about sustainability, governance, and social purpose into the boardroom at BC Lottery Corporation, which is a Crown corporation, and took those ideas into the boardroom there. So now that organization has best practices in social purpose, in purpose oversight, in purpose management, and strategies and things. So, that's all done as a board member. So and then everything I learned at BC Lottery Corporation, I am now sharing with Ivy Business School, who engaged me to write a case study of BC Lottery Corporation's approach to purpose governance in this case. So, when I say a career path, it's like not linear.
Yeah.
But what is consistent is this idea of impact. And in my case, a modest theory of change that helps me steer in terms of where it is I should be spending my time.
Yeah, that sounds so fascinating. And it's really interesting that you've had so many different career paths within your career, I would say. My next question is, what volunteering initially led you to want to study social work and go into that?
Well, I was quite young at the time, and so my volunteering was with I think I was a big sister, if you're familiar with that program, where I volunteered to be a big sister to 7-year-old whose mom wasn't around, and the dad was struggling a little bit in raising his son alone. And so I would support that young person. And I think I was a big sister about 3 or 4 years. But that's what got me into social work. But I think I came out, I didn't have a very robust sort of way of thinking about why I would go into social work. I went into it because I wanted to, quote, help people. That was all that I had. And so I understood that if you go into social work, you could find yourself helping people. So in a way, that's what I'm doing today. So that's how it is that I chose social work. I was also volunteering for the board member and then the chair of the board of the Burnaby Volunteer Center. Then I was volunteering as a director of the United Way of the Lower Mainland. And then I got on the board of the Social Planning and Research Council of BC. And then I got on the board of the Fraser Basin Council. And then I got on the board of the Canadian Council for Social Development Federal. And then I got on the board of the North-South Institute in Ottawa. And their focus was on developing countries, sort of more international development. But this was all volunteering. And you can see the consistency of volunteering was at the board of directors level. So then that equipped me to, and with the Vancity board of directors experience, equips me to be a corporate director, if you will. And like I say, I do encourage young people to find a route to volunteer by being a director of a board. Yeah, because then when you understand how organizations work, and so yeah, that's why by the time I was 40, I knew how governance functioned, and then I knew how triple bottom line would look in an organization, and then I knew what were the incentives and the operating logic models of for-profit, not-for-profit, government, industry associations. All of that, then I leveraged by the time 40 to where I am today. Anyways, I have more to say about how I would do it differently. But basically, the field, I think of my field as I'm in the field of business as a force for good. That's my field. And that started when I was on the board of Van City. So that started when I was 30, but then I became a consultant when I was 40. And it was my experience at Van City that shaped my thinking. And back in the days of Van City, there was no playbook for how to do what we called CSR. We invented it, and we were inventing it at a board level because there was no formula for how to govern in this area. And so basically, I think of my work now as leveraging business and finance to drive social outcomes or societal outcomes, to put humanity on a path of sustainability. So that's what I think of as my field. And I think my governance and my triple bottom line experience and my multi-sector experience is what equipped me to play a role in this field.
Yeah, that sounds like a great way to put it, like business as a force for good, because I've never really like thought about like using business in like a more like sustainable like lens or like to help people. So my next question is, what were your greatest accomplishments and joys?
Well, when I look back, what I find most satisfying about my experience is like not by design, but when I look back, I realize that I was at the forefront of a lot of social movements. So today we would be aware that there's a social movement around social enterprise, and you can get a degree in social enterprise, etc. Well, back in the 80s, I probably wrote one of the first toolkits on how to run a social enterprise, which is why when I became the executive director of a social enterprise, I actually knew how to operate one because I'd written the toolkit. So I was in the early days of organizing around social enterprise, which was under the heading of community economic development. And I guess I would say I was the field builder for, creating a field of practice around community economic development organizing. And also, when I was the director of social policy for the BC government, I led the creation of a community economic development strategy for the province, which I was able to do because I had done that early work on what does it mean to organize around community economic development. So those two fields. And then when I got on the board of Van City, we were leaders in socially responsible investing. So right through the 90s, I got very involved in the SRI movement, we called it. Today, you would call it social or sustainable finance or maybe responsible investing. But I was in the early, in the vanguard of it when people were just learning about it, So, and setting up products and different things that we were doing at Van City. So I became a field builder in social finance. So when I left the board of Van City, a lot of my contracts were to help the Community Foundations of Canada set up a responsible investing program, or to help Mars in Toronto create a social finance program, which they continue to operate today. But I was hired back in the day to help other institutions get going on impact investing and sustainable finance, responsible finance. So that's a sense of accomplishment to have been involved in the setting up of that. Even so, of what we called corporate social responsibility back in the day. So I was a field builder. I had, again, toolkits and how to and all these resources that were on my website. And so I have a sense of accomplishment around that. And then more recently, using the language of ESG or sustainability governance, I was a field builder in sustainability governance. I was the first faculty member teaching it probably anywhere in Canada as sustainability governance, creating a field of practice around that. I was hired by Conference Board of Canada to create a primer on sustainability governance, which is now required reading in these courses. And then more recently, social purpose. I'm a field builder there. I'm working with the Canadian Purpose Economy Project. We're coming out with a social purpose toolkit. We have standards and guidelines for how businesses should operate as social purpose companies. So again, vanguard type work. It's not mainstream yet, trying to mainstream it. And another area of interest of mine is field building around the role of associations. So think industry associations like, the Logistics Association of Canada, or professional associations like Marketing Association of Canada, just for two examples. So I partnered with the Canadian Standards Association to create a toolkit for how associations can help their entire membership, their entire sector, or their entire profession advance on sustainability. So in 2007, I pitched a project to Natural Resources Canada that they would hire me and a colleague to do a scan of best practices in CSR for industry associations. So we created this toolkit. And then more recently, the Canadian Standards Association and I partnered to create guidelines, CSA guidelines, like almost a standard for how associations can help their members move forward on sustainability. So field building there. So if you go to my website, you can see that there's blogs on these various topics and articles on these various topics. And so I guess, that really speaks to some of my accomplishments that give me a feeling of satisfaction, that plus having affected the trajectory of Vancity and the trajectory of BC Lottery Corporation, their transformations and the role I played as a director. And in terms of, what brings me joy is frankly getting to work with people like you, students and leaders and everybody who have passions to change the world. And so that is what brings me joy every day, is to work with amazing humans who share this passion and commitment.
Wonderful.
Mhm.
So my next question is, what are your biggest obstacles you faced and how did you overcome them?
Well, I guess the biggest obstacles I faced were consistent in that I have found myself to be like a pioneer or in the vanguard of all these movements. And there are many movements to come, to follow. Others will pick up on all of these threads and take them further. And it will be interesting to see what things look like in the 2030s and the 2040s and the 2050s as things go. The biggest obstacles that I faced on the way, because I was working in vanguard roles, is the status quo as an obstacle. I find pretty well all my work is to get individuals to want to do something different that they weren't doing before. Doesn't matter what, the topic is. So I'm trying to speak to them, and they could, if you will, represent the status quo. And I'm trying to shift the status quo so it drives more impact, because we recognize, of course, that the status quo is creating problems for humanity and the planet in a big way. And so it all needs to be changed and recalibrated and re-engineered and other things. So the status quo has been a big obstacle. And another big obstacle has been the patriarchy, because as a woman in boardrooms and other places, executive rooms, etc. It hasn't always been easy to deal with, let's just call it the patriarchy, certain individuals who, set up barriers to me as an individual to progress. And in both those cases, which are almost the same thing, the patriarchy equals the status quo, one could argue, the how I overcame them, or let's say continue to face those challenges, but how do I overcome them? And what has been my track record of success is actually something I learned in social work school. But it's this idea of speaking truth to power. And so I find it's a very human process. We're always dealing with humans at the other end. And so speaking truth to power, standing up to the power that represents the old way, and frankly, leveraging my social work skills to speak of my lived experience and its relevance, etc., has been my way forward, always my way forward. And you would find me to be quite a direct person. So I have always used that style, to speak to those at the other end of the table, to bring them along. And I've been successful in that. And then the third obstacle is a self-imposed one. The other two weren't self-imposed. This one is quote unquote the imposter syndrome, a self-imposed barrier. Because I was always in the vanguard, even when I became a social planner for the city of Surrey, I was the first social planner for the city of Surrey, and there weren't that many social planners around. I didn't actually know how to be a social planner. Like, I didn't know the first thing about planning, if you will. And so, that's the imposter syndrome. I just sort of call that up. But many times when I was like the first into a space, which I often was, feeling like I was showing up and I didn't have the depth of knowledge that I would need, or the 20 years experience that I would need. I didn't have any. It was so thin. but that is to be expected when you're in new spaces. And the route to overcoming that, I have found, is to my frame is to act as if. And back in the day, I read some book on this idea of acting as if, which sort of described it as something that athletes do when they're preparing themselves for a race or whatever, a competition, where athletes, I don't know if they still do it this way, but athletes are coached to have a felt sense of them winning. What does it feel in their body to, be at their top performance or what have you? What's that felt sense? And to actually imagine how it feels and how it looks and how the limbs are working and the heart and the whole body is working in an environment where you're successful or whatnot. So this is what I mean by acting as if, is having like a felt sense that I'm that one who actually, knows this and can deliver on this and can create a pathway around this. That's what I mean by acting as if. And so as a route to overcoming that feeling of insecurity about whether you're the right one for the role or whatever. So, yeah, those are my challenges and strategies that I've used to.
Yeah, I feel like, yeah, if you were like, in boardrooms in like the 90s, the patriarchy would definitely be like an obstacle and like prevalent there. And I liked your piece on imposter syndrome because I feel like that's something that's so common, and I never actually heard the like tip about like imagining yourself at like your peak performance, so that's like really nice to know.
Yeah, and there's the other step is to imagine it and then to step into it. Like you don't just imagine it and leave it up there. You step into it and you sort of own it. And the other thing, just speaking truth to power, the other thing, again, these are somewhat sort of social work ideas that I've sort of adapted. But what I try to do, this is with the status quo or patriarchy, when I come across that as a barrier, is I try to energetically speak at their level, energetically show up the way they're showing, not in an abusive way, but energetically showing up, like not showing up with lesser energy.
Yeah.
Because then they'll, speak down to you or whatever. But I'm just speaking about body energy, like felt sense of your energetic self. And I show up energetically at the same level. And I found so that they know that they're like dealing with somebody that they have to like pay attention to or whatever. I always try to match, people's energy and show up at the level that they're at, how they're tuning themselves. I try to tune myself intentionally, sort of in the same.
Yeah, that sounds like such great advice. My next question is, how do you see the future of the career path that you're on right now?
Again, I still wrestle with this idea of a career path, but I do define it as, business as a force for good, which became an intentional shift halfway through my career. And so what's the future of business as a force for good? Well, when I started in that field, again, I guess Van City is my experimental time, the 1990s. It was niche. It was not mainstream. And now business is a force for good. That idea is a normalized idea. We can just look to this idea of B corporations. Lots of business people know about B corporations. So that shows that it's sort of a mainstream idea. You can get certified as a B Corp, having a social purpose and having all these good practices. So I would say the future of this idea of business is a force for good. I still think we're somewhat if you zoom out and then just take a look at what's happened over the last 30 years in that space. If you zoom out, we're still in the early innings of reimagining the role of business in the world. And if you zoom out, you would come to understand that depending on your outlook 200 years ago, when capitalism was getting going, or 50 years ago, when business schools started to teach this idea that the purpose of business was to create profits, right? Started 50 years ago, that idea. And now all business schools teach that the purpose of business is to create profits. That's really all you're taught. And then how to make profits is sort of what you're taught in business school. What we're doing at the Canadian Purpose Economy Project is we're reaching out to business schools to invite them to now start teaching social purpose in business, where the purpose of the business is to create a better future for humanity, where profits becomes a means to an end, but not the end in itself. So if you zoom out, we're still in the experimental phase of what all that looks like. And so going forward, this career path would be to just basically, I look at my own career, is to look at, the things that have been built by myself and others, and now scale it into business school education, into investing, into the way what associations, sector associations are telling their members is good practice, scale it through boards of directors having oversight of the organization's purpose, and where the board of directors adopts a purpose for that organization, company, or nonprofit or whatever, to have a purpose to create a better world. So we're just starting to, through the Canadian Purpose Economy Project, promote this idea to Canadian businesses. And we've just set up a global roundtable to find other actors who are trying to create what we call a purpose economy and create toolkits and resources and a social purpose designation and a social purpose textbook and a social purpose toolkit and resources. So now, if you can follow it, from community economic development organizing and from businesses adopting CSR strategies, we're now trying to really change the formula of what does success look like in business. And it took 50 years to secure the old way of businesses only existing to create profits. So it shouldn't take 50 years to reorganize that, maybe 20 years or so to reorganize the formula. And so when I think about the future of this career path, it's really redesigning capitalism to be a force for good. And some would say we shouldn't have capitalism at all. And I'm sympathetic to that perspective too. But I am working in the system to change the system. So that's how I would see it being changed. And then the other place to go, when I mentioned working with industry and professional associations, so we've got this toolkit from the Canadian Standards Association. And it's a set of 80 practices that an industry association can adopt to move its sector or its profession forward on sustainability, where perhaps the sector association could encourage its members to adopt a social purpose. And if its members adopt a social purpose, not just ESG, if its members adopt a social purpose, then the sector can become a force for good, or the profession can become a force for good, but not just the sector, the value chain of the sector. But we have to rewire value chains too to become a force for good. So that CSA tool I mentioned really puts associations on the path to doing it. And it's a global resource. So I think, the future is taking all these ideas beyond Canada and making them global. So we can really redefine the way the economy operates and the way value chain operates so that they're all a force for good. Yeah, so that's what I see of as the future of the career path. And basically, it's wide open for young people. When I began, I had to invent this, but now this career path is laid out. Now you can get jobs as an ESG analyst, you can get a job in impact investing, you can get a job in sustainable procurement or climate strategy. And when I started, you couldn't, now you can. But for some young people, you may want to become field and capacity builders too, and work on some of these broader systemic questions. And yeah, so I think that's where the future career path is really finding out what's in the heart of young people and uplifting them and equipping young people to play a leadership role so they can bring the perspective of future generations and social justice into capitalism and value chains.
And would you say that the business world is like kind of waking up to the idea of like sustainable business, or is it still more of like an uphill battle?
Yeah, I think that this idea of sustainable business, I think it's become quite a mainstream idea. The battles are circumstantial. So right now in the United States, there's an administration that doesn't believe in this and is passing laws against it and whatnot. So for the next 4 years, there'll be headwinds. And that is sort of rippling out into other jurisdictions because they're threatening tariffs and whatnot if other countries don't follow suit. So this is a really big headwind for sustainable business, not to downplay it, but then the winds will change and then it will go back. I think businesses understand that there's value in a sustainable business model. I think that's well understood. And it's also centered in education now, whereas 20 and 30 years ago it wasn't. So you would now graduate as a business student or whatnot, knowing the importance of sustainability. So young people moving into positions of leadership and starting up companies and whatever, they'll have more insights on it. So I think going forward, sustainable business has a positive trend line. What I'm working on now is beyond sustainable business, but it's the social purpose of the business. And so that we're just trying to get the flywheel going on that.
What would you tell your 22-year-old self now about this career space after all of your experience?
Yes. Well, thank you for settling on that last question, because over my career, I have come to some conclusions from my lived experience on how to drive the most impact sooner, faster, etc. And so, based on my experience, what I would tell my younger self is don't work one company at a time, work sectorally. Now that I'm onto this idea with this Canadian Standards Association tool, like I'm trying to speak to as many industry associations as possible to move an entire sector forward on sustainability, not just one company. If you can imagine the exponential impact of that. So, I would say to myself, if you want impact, Coro, in the business realm or in the market economy, don't work one company at a time. I would also say, even though this sounds like I'm just disagreeing with or contradicting what I just said, don't work one sector at a time, even though I just said work sectorally. You basically have to work on the value chain. One company can't become sustainable on its own. It has to work within its sector because it'll face too many barriers working on its own. So the sector has to become sustainable together. They have to move forward together. And then one sector can't become sustainable on its own. It has to work on its supply chain, its customers or its suppliers, or whatever. They need to move forward on sustainability too. So you actually need to work multi-sectorally to drive impact. So I would say to myself, try to find those spaces. And related to that, I would say to myself, work at the values chain or the systems level. And that's where social purpose becomes relevant, because these companies that adopt a social purpose to create a better world, they're basically setting up an objective, a singular objective, to improve their particular system. So if they're a food manufacturing company, chances are they're going to have a social purpose to enhance food security. And then they would want to be changing the systems of the value chains around food security. That social purpose company. Working at the value chain or the systems level is how I would approach my career now if I were to start it over. And I would get skills in that area where you can learn about systems change and that kind of thing. We touched on it in social work, but not to the degree I think I would need to play a significant role there. And also, I would say to my younger self, potentially work at the board level, get on boards, and learn the skills of governance, and then try to influence governance wherever you are. Back in the day, I remember when I was on the board of Van City, they had something called a governance committee. That governance committee of the board, a subcommittee of the board, was responsible for the governance of the organization. And that was, me in my 30s. That was the last committee I wanted to be on. I thought, nah, it's sort of philosophical, it's boring, like, you know. And then, but in hindsight, that's the first committee to go on, because what you really want to do is get on the governance committee of an organization and bring social purpose to it and sustainable governance to it and rewire governance, basically. And I didn't know that back at Van City. But when I went on the board of BC Lottery Corporation, I put my hand up to go on the governance committee, and I eventually became chair of it. And that's where you can have more influence. So work at the board level, work on governance questions. I would say this to my younger self. And also, as I've mentioned, work at the purpose level. So of course, most of my career was built on, from the 2000s on, was built around helping businesses get sustainability strategies. And now, going forward, I've absolutely pivoted. I still do that. I can do that. But my first question to a client would be, have you defined your purpose? Because maybe I could help you define your purpose. So work at the purpose of the organization, because then you could bring all the organizations enterprise-wide, its influence, its reach, its scale, its assets, its resources, its relationships. It brings everything to the social outcomes that it's defined for itself, whether it's food security or to accelerate the circular economy or to create a world without waste or to accelerate the low carbon economy. Companies are adopting these kinds of social purposes, and then they bring everything to drive that outcome beyond just their sustainability strategies. Work at the purpose level, and then work at the industry level. As I mentioned, try to work to support sectors or try to work to support professions, because they all have to be transformed to create a pathway for a sustainable future for humanity. And so that is your lived experience. And I would use that and I would drive forward on the basis that, because in my perspective, the system isn't working, whatever that element of the system is, and trust your instincts on that. And then speak truth to power about that. And as I said, work at the system, the board, and the purpose level for the most impact. as big as you feel drawn to. And then spend a bit of time imagining what your big dream is, and then set about manifesting that. So again, I created this idea. I wanted to influence the market economy, and then I'm manifest on that. I don't every day say, what element of the market economy am I going to, change today? I don't approach it that way. It's just like a call to action for myself. And then every day I'm just in flow working on this or that aspect of this dream that I'm trying to.
Yeah. Thank you so much. And thank you so much for the whole interview. It was really lovely to hear how far you've come and what you've done with your career journey, I would say, instead of path, maybe. Yeah, thank you so much.